Welcome to Digication Scholars Conversations. I'm your host, Jeff Yan. In this episode, you will hear part 2 of my conversation with Marc Thompson, Assistant Director for Teaching and Learning Experiences at the Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. He is also the Program Director for the Information Accessibility, Design, and Policy Program. More links and information about today's conversation can be found on Digication's Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Full episodes of Digication Scholars Conversations can be found on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. If you are creating tools for other people to use, whether it be someone like us who's a vendor, provide platforms, digital platforms for institutions. But really, there are people create tools for the world, for all kinds of purposes, right? But what are some advice that you would have in terms of accessibility? What do they have to think about? What is it that will bridge that gap as we were talking about?
Well, I can speak to that on a number of different levels. I'll start maybe with at the higher level and say that, a recent WebAIM poll, WebAIM stands for Web Accessibility in Mind, AIM, showed that formal training in this area ranked last among the top 10 ways of learning about accessibility, which goes back to the point I was making about mentoring and apprenticeship as well. But it also speaks to the need for more formal training in this area. Some of that's coming more informally through collaboration, but I think there's a lot more work to be done by formally including accessibility and universal design in the curriculum, particularly in computer science and engineering courses, but also in art and design courses. We've been recently awarded a faculty grant to a member of our recreation, sport, and tourism department who works with accessible and inclusive spaces, right? So, and is, really training her students to think about venues in that way. So there's that level of it. But then there's also the right down to the nitty gritty functional tasks that are involved in performing, something that your users are doing frequently, whether it's an editor tool for a specific task with the editor tool that they're performing. And one of the things that we stress in the IADP program, we have one of our projects is a usability testing project. But in that context, we talk about the importance of including people with disabilities in your usability testing. So here you have an example that you mentioned of someone who is blind, who is giving you a lot of helpful feedback. But then, what about keyboard-only users, right, who are not blind? And there are differences there, even though blind users are keyboard-only users for obvious reasons. And so what is their user experience like as they try to work? And what can you learn from them in the design there? What about neurodiverse people involved in the usability testing? So stressing the importance there of the diversity of people that are involved in the usability testing, that part of the design of the product.
Now, to me, as someone who's, I lived in Silicon Valley for about 10 years, and I see a lot of, people doing, so to speak, cutting edge, technology work. Accessibility was not talked about almost ever. In fact, when I reach out to people, my colleagues to, ask for advice, they are all sort of like, I think that most people, they try not to say it this way, but ultimately it comes out to be, well, what exactly is percentage of people that would be using this? Do you really need to address them?
It's been over 15 years, but I do remember we all knew it, that when people heard the word accessibility back then, they would run the other way. And we looked for other ways to explain that, so that there was that trepidation there, but I think that's really gone away. And I've watched, over the years, I've watched companies like Microsoft over the past maybe 8 or 9 years make giant steps in the area of accessibility. And it's really interesting to see the way the design is evolving in such a way that accessibility is not something that we do after the fact, something that we fix, but it's an integral part of the authoring process. It's just baked in, almost like accessibility by default. And we're getting closer to it with things like the accessibility checker in real time, which is also almost a learning tool in and of itself. We had a prototype here called Ally First. Ally is a numeronym for accessibility, with the 11 being the missing 11 characters in the word accessibility between the A and the Y. And this was an editor, John Gunderson really spearheaded that effort, building on the back of open source editor, CK Editor. But looking at it from this perspective of how do we enable users to author accessible content by default, and how do we educate them in the process? So I think, Microsoft is doing that. I'm looking also at features like email feature, where in your personal settings, you can stipulate that you want your content, email content, to be accessible. But when that plays out, you have other users who are getting email from that person, and it's saying that, so-and-so would like his content or her content to be accessible. And so what does that mean? And I think there's a circular process there, but increasingly we're moving toward with authoring products where accessibility is really the default.
I think that's a really good point. I think a lot of authoring tools are starting to really pay good attention to accessibility, and I think that's a good place for us to pivot to Teach Access for a little bit as well. Teach Access is this organization that I believe that you are a board member. Am I right? I read that,
yes.
And I didn't know that, Mark, because we just started doing some collaboration with them as well. I don't know if you knew, but
they're a wonderful organization. As I said, I remember talking to a couple of people back in 2014 and said, hey, we're getting this organization started, and it's really about bridging the gap between industry and higher ed. And I thought, gee, that's really a great idea. And so Teach Access has really grown a lot since then. We've got very active involvement from a number of industries and higher ed institutions. And we're working on bridging that gap from multiple fronts. So, for example, we recently went through the cycle of evaluating grants for faculty who are incorporating universal design and accessibility as part of their curriculum. So that's one big effort. Teach Access also has a study away program for students in high school and college, and I think that's great. They get the experience of going out into industry and seeing what goes on in making the product accessible, what their team is doing in that area. I'm very happy to say that I was able to contribute a little bit to that effort by making Coursera MOOC available to the study away students, the certificate portion of that available to those students. They're also working at this bridging between industry and higher ed in the area of accreditation. So they're working closely with ABAT, organizations like ABAT for engineering, so that formally, we are actually including the teaching of universal design and accessibility principles in the curriculum for computer science and engineering students. So really, we've got a faculty fellowship program, which we're starting. We just piloted recently, and so that's going to be getting off the ground as well. So I'm really proud to be part of that organization and contributing to that effort to bridge that gap between higher ed and industry.
Yeah, it is really what a wonderful organization. I particularly was very impressed by the faculty grant that it is doing right now, and we'll post a link to the teachaccess.org site in our show notes, and to some of these resources that exist on the site, which is just fabulous. Now,
Thank you for doing that, Jeff. I mean, I've had the experience of evaluating the grant proposals, and it's really interesting to see the range of disciplines now that are thinking very creatively about ways to incorporate universal design in the curriculum.
Well, I think for people like you and me, we believe that education can be the thing that changes the world, right? And it really starts at places like this, right? It starts at these kind of opportunities, and slowly, but gradually, we get to change the mindset of society. We get to instill this idea that, hey, look, being inclusive and being, considering universal design both in learning as well as just in general is just something that we need to do for the world. And it's right. Just like we think about ethics and other, aspects of life,
Well, earlier you mentioned, when we were talking about, 60% of institutions finding it very difficult to find somebody with expertise in this area, but also what are the kinds of questions that we should be asking from these candidates? What are we looking for? What is a VPAT? A voluntary product accessibility template, and how important is that? I know that a lot of companies, I don't say this disparagingly, but a lot of vendors will talk about the VPAT. They'll mention some legal guidelines like Section 508, maybe the web content accessibility guidelines, but really until you look at the product itself closely, you don't really know. And the VPATs can vary wildly from totally inaccurate to maybe a third party, very experienced company who's come in and done the VPAT for that organization. But I did want to mention on that specific point, again, going back to Teach Access, they are putting together a collection of job descriptions that include accessibility. Have you seen those?
It's wonderful,
Jeff. Yeah, and interview questions. So really, I'm very pleased at the way that organization is approaching this from multiple fronts.
So final plug for Teach Access, the executive director, Kate Sonka, she, believe it or not, was a Digication user when she was a student.
Well, I've got one for you too, Jeff. She is a graduate of the IADP program.
It's just wonderful. I think that I don't know what the chance is, but just it feels like all the people that really like this stuff, we all ended up meeting each other one way or another. Right?
Yeah. It's
pretty amazing. So I want to ask you a little bit about, now I think that hopefully folks who are listening to this, who are still listening to this, would find in their, if they don't know about accessibility, this is probably one of those conversations that makes them think a little bit more about it, or makes them be, feel like, well, maybe I should look up, maybe I should go and find more resources. And there are tons of resources, and And for some, they might be looking for, no, I've been looking for programs like IADP, a formal training certificate program offered by a university that has great reputation, great credibility, lots of, real world knowledge and experiences. They can do that. And I really want to make sure people know about the IADP program because it's such a wonderful experience. At Digication, it's now become a policy that anyone that wants to attend that will get it paid for, whenever they want.
And I'll mention, if you want an easy, if this is something you're just getting started at and maybe you want to test the waters a little bit, I would strongly recommend the free Coursera MOOC, an introduction to accessibility and inclusive design. This is a course that really is, introductory, but I think presents a number of, we tried to create a number of spotlight videos which gave different perspectives on accessibility, particularly from people in the field, maybe people working in accommodation, people who are experts in universal design for learning, all of which, in addition to the perspectives from people with different disabilities, I think make that course a good introduction to the topic. And then the depth that we provide in the 24-week IADP program, it is 3 courses, 3 8-week fully online asynchronous courses. So it's a time commitment by today's standards, where I think a lot of people are hoping to just learn it all in a 3-day workshop. But our graduates go on to straight from the program to take the IAAP certification exam, and they're passing it, and they're writing about it on our IADP LinkedIn site, which is a group LinkedIn site that I set up to sort of gather graduates from the program and help maintain that network. They basically helped me set that up. They told me, well, we'd really enjoyed being with one another for 24 weeks, and now you give us a certificate and we have to say goodbye to one another. And that made me think, why don't I extend the learning community there? So we're sharing with each other. People are getting internships or new jobs. They're sharing information like that, tips, or even just sharing successes like, hey, I went on and I passed the CPAC exam for the IAAP, which in turn encourages other people to go ahead and do that. So
I think that that is really wonderful. And I would share something that, perhaps from a small company that's not a Microsoft, where we feel like that accessibility has been a competitive edge for us. It's not an afterthought, and it's not a waste of resources. It's not a resource that you can't afford not to have. It's something that what we have found, and it's not just because our customers happen to demand accessibility, but it actually goes all the way to recruiting, for example. So we believe that more and more engineers, more and more people who are in any roles, from marketing to sales to support, right? They don't want to work for a company where accessibility is not considered. They don't want to work for a company where they have to tell their customers that, oh, you want accessibility? Not here. We don't do that. They don't want to work for that company. We have found that, it's for anyone who had that misconception that, well, it's going to cost us a lot of money to do this. I think there is an initial investment, but I think it's well worth it. Today, I would say that, for example, in every aspect of our product design, all the way to delivery and, our support process, accessibility is a big topic. So from our very designer, when they're sketching out something, I'm not saying that they will sketch it out in a way that, when someone is just sketching out the idea of a user interface, I'm not talking about what people think about, like, oh, are you putting in an alt tag during the sketch? No, we're talking papers, they're just drawing something out. But it's the concept of what they're thinking about. So conceptually, they're not just thinking about, will there be an alt tag to an image or an area label to a user interface element. It's actually about how they are going to consider the interaction, the usability, how many, like you were saying, how many clicks, how many tabs it takes for a person to go from one place to another. And then for the developers, for the programmers, and then all the way to right now, before any of our code get pushed, in Digication, formally, there is a requirement that an accessibility review has been done. Some of it is automated by tools, like you had mentioned. Some of it is by humans, has to actually go through it and evaluate that. These are things that, maybe it takes just a little bit longer, but actually overall, it also happened to have made our tools better. Had made it more usable for everyone, not just anyone, the people that have to be using a screen reader. And so I would hope that, this becomes more of a norm than someone have to go out of their way to do this.
I think you made a number of good points there, Jeff. I mean, the first of which I think is about the climate around accessibility at the company level. But I'll say that in higher ed, not too long ago, I did a talk for the grad academy, grad students who were just beginning to teach. It was a session on making your online course accessible. And as they were walking in the door, I overheard two students saying, "This is the session I really wanted to attend." And, "Oh, me too. I really like this topic. I'm really interested in this topic." And I thought to myself, what a far cry this is from back in 2014 when people ran the other way. So they're aware, and I think the climate really is changing on that. And marketing is also a good point. For sure, legally, it's interesting. I still scratch my head when an organization can have an inaccessible product, and yet if that product is used at a university, for example, and the university is liable for that product, the university can be sued, not the company. So in some ways, really, the leveraging that higher ed institutions have is at that juncture with purchasing, right? If they can work with the vendor so that, they can make that product more accessible. And I'll say that nothing is 100% accessible from the start. And as updates are made, things change, things break. But that focus on the usability and the functional tasks is really critical. Even if you look at something like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and how those have evolved. You mentioned we're not so much looking at the nitty-gritty of the alt text, but looking at the first iteration of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which were very much tied to specific technical things like alt text, and then how that evolved with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0, because the initial version of it was outdated almost immediately because technology changes so rapidly. And so the principle-based nature of the WCAG Web Content Accessibility Guidelines has in some ways future-proofed it a little bit more, but it's very much principle-based. And when you break it down, it is the POUR principles, P-O-U-R, right? Perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And so those are very, if you think about it, those are very rooted in universal design, but also functional.
Now, I'm going to close out this conversation with a question on sort of from an institution standpoint, I think that you and I are both cheerleaders for this. We want this to happen. We see it, the positive side of what happens right now. We also see, on the other hand, instructors coming out of, several years of, because of the COVID, being pretty burnt out. And then when they come back, they are being asked to do hybrid courses, which they are not used to, and they're finding it difficult. They're finding that they are being asked to, deliver their course in person, but also online at the same time. So they're looking into a camera, but also looking into a sea of people in their classroom and trying to make all of this, potential collaboration and synergy work between, these different realms of, existence. And at the same time, we're saying, well, you should embrace universal design and learn, for learning. You should create multiple modalities, for delivering your content and so on. So some of the things that I hear from instructors today are that they're going, well, how do I even get to that point? Like it used to be that I say this one thing one time and that seemed to have been enough. And now I have to deliver it so many different ways to different audiences in different, multiple times. What are some, real practical strategies for an institution or faculty members, or if you are, a program director or a chair or a dean you may have some resources, but how do you even start to tackle all of this? Because, this is the reality of where they are today.
That's a great question, especially since the new team we're building is precisely
right.
in that position, right? How do we roll this out to the campus at large, and how do we approach faculty members who are looking at this even post-pandemic as a daunting task? I do think that a cultural shift occurred post-pandemic. We're very comfortable now with some of the tools that we use, the web conferencing tools, for example. Zoom really is ubiquitous. But I can remember before the pandemic when I might have suggested for one reason or another that we meet via web conferencing, and the faculty member said, well, what's that? And so really it was a sea change there. So I think that was also very helpful to some instructors. They might have been dragged into what we then referred to as emergency remote teaching, but it's continued to evolve, and we can build on that. At the faculty level, one of the things that Thomas Tobin stresses in his book, Reach Everyone, Teach Everyone, is the +1 method. And that is a mindset of thinking about universal design for learning more from an iterative perspective. So earlier, for instance, we were talking about the syllabus and ways in which you could focus on making that syllabus more in line with universal design principles. It's focusing on one element of the classes, maybe even in one assessment in that course. How could I make that one assessment more aligned to UDL principles, perhaps by offering students different ways to complete that assignment and yet meeting the same learning outcomes, or providing multiple deliverable formats for that assignment, whether it be video or something text-based or an infographic, for instance. Again, achieving the same learning outcomes, but allowing for multiple modes of expression for learners. But the key there is, so there are two strategies that I have in mind for working with faculty at this level. One is that iterative plus method. The other one is getting faculty to acknowledge or recognize that they're already incorporating UDL principles in their course, because there are a lot of overlaps with more traditional best practices for instructional design. So as I'm moving into the Faculty Summer Institute here at University of Illinois, May 23rd and 24th, we're going to have a learning design table where we'll have some of our faculty who do human-centered design and universal design for learning at the table. Some will be talking about interaction design and visual design. But what I want to stress from my perspective, first, to establish that foundation, that comfort level, is that getting faculty to recognize where they're already using some of these universal design principles and build on that foundation. I think it really can be overwhelming to approach this, as in its entirety. Go through and do it all for an entire course. So that said, I think there's a lot of promise for approaching program design through that lens of universal design. There's a real opportunity there at the design stage. I'm looking forward to maybe getting to do that with some programs that are coming out for development. This may be one area where our Universal Design for Learning team gets involved. But those are some strategies that come readily to mind for working with faculty. At the institutional level, it helps when you have some supports in place, like an accessibility policy, sensitivity to inclusion and diversity, whether that's a mission statement that's clearly expressed or syllabus language that encapsulates that, or tenure and promotion requirements can include that.
And now you had mentioned very at the top of our conversation today that you also have a UDL certificate program, but for faculty at your institution right now. Is that what's happening?
We are just getting started with that at our institution, and working out the curriculum of that. And this is something I would love to not only our faculty, but open that up to our sister campuses at Springfield and Chicago. Perhaps beyond that, I'm thinking big, but our Big Ten academic alliance partners, I think that would widen the scope of it even more.
I'm thinking that resources like this could become the piece that almost feels like if I run a program, I'm a department chair, I'm a dean of a college somewhere, or even if I'm a provost, for a university, the ability to know that there are highly trained, highly experienced professionals who've been thinking about this in a very serious manner and have thought about how to look at it at a curriculum level. Look at it from a program design level, look at it from a faculty development level that bakes it into sort of the entire, bakes it into their program, meaning that it is not just a slap on, hey, here's a additional thing that you can do if you want to do it. It's more about, hey, this is what we care about here. We talk about inclusivity, and this is how we express ourselves.
Yes, and I think with online programs in particular, and the huge wave of online programs that is still cresting, I believe, in the rush to get these programs out, there is a tendency to focus at a more atomic level on the individual courses, but not to think about, the continuity or the core competencies, for example, that are going to be moving through that program. So being able to get in and think about this at the program level is very important. Something like portfolios like Digication are a great way to help pull that thread through and to capture really evidence of those core competencies.
Yeah. Well, all right. Well, Marc, thank you so much for sharing everything today. I feel like I've taken a lot longer than I had promised you before. I apologize, but I have learned so much. Every time I talk to you, I learn so much, and I'm always inspired. I look forward to hearing more about this new UDL team and what you do with it. I have big expectation. I feel like that's just knowing your history and what you've done. I feel like this is going to be a real legacy that you're going to be leaving behind, and I look forward to being.
I would love to see 3 years from now a universal design for learning center here within the CITL.
Okay, well, yeah,
we'll
we'll check in, and hope that we can have that conversation 3 years from now, and I'll be able to congratulate you. But meanwhile, thank you again for all your insights, and it's really just wonderful to be able to share just a sliver of the kind of things that you do. And we've just been such a fortunate recipients of being able to work with you and your team. It's been a real honor, and I hope we continue to do that for a long time.
I would like to thank Digication as well for being very proactive in this area.
Okay, well, take care and talk soon. This concludes our conversation. To hear our next episode, be sure to subscribe to Digication Scholars Conversations on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. The Digication Scholars Conversation series is brought to you by Digication, a technology platform powering the most innovative e-portfolio programs in K-12 and higher education. Our website can be found at digication.com. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please like, subscribe, and share with a friend. Thanks for tuning in.